Thank you so much, Christina and Judy, and all that had a part in our service today. You know, I couldn't help but notice when the kids were up here, what are you afraid of in the children's story? And one said, the bad guys. I remember when I was maybe 5, 6, 7, 8, you always had to watch for the bad guys. The bad guys were real. The bad guys lived down the street. In fact, I'm thinking of two bad guys in particular, and these young boys, they were about our age, but they were the bad guys. They used language that we didn't use. Their family life was just very different, and what they watched and all these other, they were just, well, in our little sphere, they were the bad guys. And so what do you do when there's a bad guy? You make a plan. And so you have maps and you have forts and you name those forts. We're going to be in the eagle's nest, and then we're going to go down to the cover, and all the cars that start to go by, they're bad guys too. They're spies. And so you have to make play guns, and you dig ditches, and you do all these things because you're always hiding from the bad guys. You even have a zip lines, so when they see you, you say, oh, they're coming, zzz, down into another fort, and you're gone. Camouflage. Anybody else ever do these things? And sometimes you'd have booby traps. You would maybe dig holes and put sticks over top and put leaves, and they would break the sticks and fall like a whole foot and a half. And when they fell, what happened? Got them! Yeah! Or maybe you put tripwire. Maybe even the fishing line, so you can't even see it. So they're running after you. You know where it is because you put some secret little thing. It's this high and this high. And so when you come, you just jump over it. And here come the bad guys, and they trip and they fall. And as kids, what do we say to the bad guys when they fall? Ha, 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 you fell. You didn't see the trip line. How about as adults? In your sphere, your world, your life, are there bad guys? People out to get you? And what happens when they fall? Hopefully as adults, you don't say, ha ha, you fell. Hee 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 hee. But are we immune to a response that is not what it should be? Maybe we don't even say a word. We just kind of give a look like, serves you right. Or maybe it's that polite giggle that we try and cover like, did you see how no, I'm not laughing. What do you do? How do you respond when your enemy, when your antagonist falls? Well, that's what we're going to look at today. We're still going through this series on David, a man after God's own heart, and that's the title of this one, part number 12, When Your Enemy Falls. And we're going to open up our Bibles and turn to the last chapter. I believe that's where we're going in 1 Samuel. And you might recall when we last left Saul, he was desperate, and as a result was going to the witch of Endor. When we last left David, he was hiding with the Philistines according to his own bright idea. And when they came back to Ziklag on one particular occasion, everything was destroyed. Their wives and their daughters and children, I should say, were taken. And his own men were speaking of stoning him. And so he also was in a time of desperation. Saul went to a witch. David when he reached his lowest point, looked to God for strength and for help. Both in different places, both different responses, but that's essentially where we are when we get to today's piece in 1 Samuel chapter 31, and I'm going to pick it up in verse 2. Then the Philistines followed hard after Saul and his sons, and the Philistines killed Jonathan, Abinadab, Malchishua, Saul's sons. And the battle became fierce against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was severely wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised men come and thrust me through and abuse me." But his armor-bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell on it. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died with him. And so in verse 6 we read, "So Saul, his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and all his men died together that same day." That's a very tragic end, is it not? And the details that follow are quite grim. The enemy removes the head from Saul, strips him of his armor, takes the armor to the temple of their false gods. This is a way of saying our God is more powerful. Some bragging rights. And then they put Saul's body on display. Hanging on a fence, decapitated. And by the end of this chapter, a group of people, Jabesh Gilead, travel all night to steal the body of Saul and his sons that are on display and for the birds of the air and so on. And they steal the bodies, if you will. They cremate the bodies. They bury them with respect and fast for 7 days. Why? Because in chapter 11, this group of people, they were attacked. And their enemies were going to gouge out the right eye of all. And Saul heard about this, and he rallied a huge force of over 300,000 men. And he comes to their rescue in a time of peril. And so out of respect and gratitude, they come at great risk to themselves to take Saul and his sons, to bury their dead king. And perhaps in that there's a lesson for us. May our memories of kindness be long, and our memory of offenses be short. And so then we move over to 2 Samuel chapter 1 as David receives word. 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 1. And we read, "Now it came to pass after the death of Saul, and when David had returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites, and David had stayed 2 days in Ziklag, on the 3rd day, behold, it happened that a man came from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dust on his head. So it was when he came to David that he fell to the ground and prostrated himself. And David said to him, 'Where have you come from?'" Obviously, this is not typical or usual. This is a messenger. He's been roughed up. What's going on? Tell me the news. And so he said to him, "I've escaped from the camp of Israel." Verse 4, "Then David said to him, 'How did the matter go? Please tell me.' And he answered, 'The people have fled from the battle. Many of the people are fallen and dead. And Saul and Jonathan, his son, are dead also.' So David said to the young man who told him, 'How do you know that Saul and Jonathan, his son, are dead?' Verse 6, then the young man who told him said, 'As it happened by chance to be, as I happened by chance to be on Mount Gilboa, there was Saul leaning on his spear, and indeed the chariots and horsemen followed hard after him. Now when he looked behind him, he saw me and called to me.'" Here we're entering into a different account, by the way. "And I answered, 'Here I am.' And he said to me, 'Who are you?' So I answered him, 'I am an Amalekite.' And he said to me again, 'Please stand over me and kill me. For anguish has come upon me, but my life still remains in me.' So I stood over him and killed him, because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the bracelet that was on his arm, and I have brought them here to my Lord." Now again, these verses are very contradictory to what we just read in the last chapter of 1 Samuel. And so he brings to David the crown, the bracelet. We have this idea, this hint really, that he is looking for some reward. He is an opportunist, I believe, a battle scavenger, we could say. And he says, I'll make up a story in which I have been the one to take Saul's life, and I will be the one. I'm the opportunist that brings the crown and the bracelet. I'll bring it to David, and this will be for me a great honor. And so he confidently is expecting that his tidings will be hailed with joy and celebration, and there'll be a rich reward for the part that he has acted. Patriarchs and Prophets 695 says, supposing that David must cherish enmity toward his relentless persecutor, the stranger hoped to secure honor to himself as the slayer of the king. He confidently expected that these tidings would be hailed with joy and that a rich reward would be for him on the part that he had acted. And I imagine those that watched and waited wanted to see how their leader would respond. It's kind of this breathtaking moment in which a lesser person probably would have rejoiced and thanked the bearer of good tidings and quickly snatched up the crown as rightly his. Aha! I mean, after all, the cloud that had so long hung over the head of David is now finally lifted. And the promise and expectation for years, some 11 years, was finally going to be realized. And Saul was not dead on David's account. He couldn't be implicated. But notice how David responded. And this will be our first point for this morning. When your enemy falls, respond with integrity. We'll notice that David doesn't respond with glee or celebration or fanfare, but rather with sincere grief for the Lord's anointed. He was genuinely devastated by the reality of the royal family's destruction. And so let's notice David's response in verse 11 and 12. Therefore David took hold of his own clothes and tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son, for the people of the Lord and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. Friends, this wasn't calculated. This was spontaneous. This is profound. This is heartfelt grief. And so David responds with integrity. He didn't rejoice, but rather displayed his loyalty, his respect, his profound, heartfelt grief. So again, I ask you, how do you respond when someone you have been in conflict with meets failure? When your enemy falls or fails? And perhaps the way opens for your own personal success as a result. How do you feel? How do you respond? What do you say? What do you do? On July 3, 1898, there was the Battle of Santiago in Cuba. And there was a concluding naval engagement of the Spanish-American War. And it sealed the U.S. victory over the Spaniards. And in the process, it said that when the men of the battleship Texas were going past the burning Spanish ship, Vizcaya, the men began to cheer. And then it was Captain John Woodward Phillip, pictured here in the corner, who said, "Men, don't cheer. The poor devils are dying." Proverbs 24:17 says, "Do not rejoice when your enemy falls. And do not let your heart be glad when he stumbles." Proverbs 17:5 says, "He who is glad at calamity will not go unpunished." The point is that your glee may well be a more punishable sin than all that your enemy has done. I mean, after all, it's easy to say, serves them right. They only got what they deserved. Even to crow inwardly or among your circle of friends, did you see what happened? Finally caught up with them. But friends, to do this is to allow a spiritual moral cancer to dominate in our own hearts. I'm thinking of Job and how he understood the significance of these types of responses. When someone is in conflict or they stumble and they fall, and when Job's friends called into question his own character, Job declared this, "Have I ever rejoiced when disaster struck my enemies? Or become excited when harm came their way?" Job says, "No. I've never sinned by cursing anyone or by asking for revenge." This man of faith kept both his heart and his tongue sensitive to the life and feelings of his enemies. It's what those who have the heart of God do. And David knew all that too well also. Psalm 35, we read some of this from David when he writes, "When I was in trouble, they were all glad and gathered around to make fun of me. Like men who would mock a cripple, they glared at me with hate. How much longer, Lord, will you just look on? Rescue me. Don't let my enemies gloat over my defeat. Don't let those who hate me for no reason smirk with delight over my sorrow." David knew exactly how it felt. In another place, Psalm 25, the first two verses, "To you, O Lord, I lift up my soul. O my God, I trust in you. Let me not be ashamed. Let not my enemies triumph over me." Yes, to be mocked when you're down is no fun. It hurts. And so again, I ask, how sensitive are you and me over the feelings and hurts of others? Even when, especially when, they have hurt us deeply. Another quotation from Patriarchs and Prophets 695 and 696. "David's grief at the death of Saul was sincere and deep, evincing the generosity of a noble nature. He did not exult in the fall of his enemy. The obstacle that had barred his success to the throne of Israel was removed, but at this he did not rejoice." You know, that's something that I don't really like about various publications. They are not official church publications, but they like to comment on things that happen within the church. And it bothers me how oftentimes they will breathlessly point out the faults of the Seventh Adventist Church, and then oftentimes report on the demise of the individual or of a church or somebody that's gone wayward in almost a gleeful fashion. Friends, I don't think that's right. I don't think it honors God. I mean, at the end of the day, Jesus grieves over the sins of his people. And when their sins catch up with them, he is in no way gleeful, but he weeps for his children. Ezekiel 33:11, "As surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but rather they turn from their ways and live. Turn from your evil ways. Why will you die, people of Israel? That's the heart of God. And that should be the heart of the Christian as well. Another place, Luke 19, 41 and 42. Now as he drew near, he saw the city, and he wept over it, saying, if you had known, even you, especially in this your day, the things that make for your peace, but now they're hidden from your eyes. He's weeping for his own people that are not receiving him, but in fact rejecting him, and will soon crucify him. Friends, how we respond to the misfortunes of those who give us pain says a lot about our own heart. Whether the human heart still lives and reigns, or if Jesus lives in me. And so when your enemy falls, by the grace of God, we need to respond with integrity. But then secondly, we need to openly acknowledge the hurt. In the verses we just read a few moments ago of the story here in 2 Samuel, David tore his clothes and he openly mourned and wept and fasted. On November 22, 1963, an assassin's bullet killed President John F. Kennedy. And on that day, Jacqueline lost her husband at the age of 34, now having to raise 2 children alone. And not only was our president dead, someone had murdered him. And the outpouring of shame and anger and confusion and grief was spontaneous, and it was heartfelt across this land and even around the world. And Jacqueline refused to be pushed aside by those wanting to take over. And she courageously planned the president, her husband's funeral. It was a sensitive blending of personal and national lament. Both her family and her nation needed to unleash their grief. And it's thought that millions gathered at our capital to mourn this loss. 92 nations were represented. An eternal flame was lit. And it is still thought of as one of the most sensitive and moving expressions of mourning ever experienced by our nation. Grief, loss, pain. And so David writes here, it's called a Song of the Bow. And we pick up in verse 17, then David lamented with his lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan his son. And he told them to teach the children of Judah the songs of the bow. Indeed, it was written in the book of Jasher. And here we have portions of it, verse 19. The beauty of Israel is slain. How the mighty have fallen. In verse 20, he says, proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice. Let's not make this a big thing. Verse 23, Saul and Jonathan were beloved, he says. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. Verse 24, weep over Saul, he says. Verse 25, how the mighty have fallen. And then for Jonathan, a friend closer than a brother, he writes verse 26, I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You have been pleasant to me. Your love to me was wonderful, surpassing the love of a woman. How the mighty have fallen. Here he's expressing the deep friendship that he has with Jonathan. And so he's touching on the enormity of Israel's loss. And in so doing, David forgets himself. He forgets all the suffering he's endured at the hands of Saul. But in this moment, he remembers the good of Saul and the ways God has used him. And all Israel is a witness to this. As David lingers in grief, lingers in the loss. And I think in doing that, he gave others permission to grieve along the way. 70% of the Psalms are laments, where David lets his tears respond to the difficulties and the death and the loss and the tragedies of life experiences. And friends, failure to lament is failure to connect, both with God and with others, with the loss, and it keeps us from being able to move forward in the strength and the hope that only God can provide. And so David's grief is public. And when he grieves, he knits the heart of the people around him even more. We didn't really finish this part of the story of the individual who I believe makes up a story. So maybe we should go back and do that now. Verse 14, so David said to him, "How was it you were not afraid to put forth your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" David didn't do it. Had multiple occasions he could have. How was it you were not afraid? Then David called one of the young men and said, "Go near and execute him." And he struck him and he died. And he said, "Your mouth has testified against you." And he grieves. He mourns. He writes the psalm of lament. A couple things about grief that I think are important. This is not in any means an exhaustive list, just a few things. But friends, grief helps you acknowledge the reality of what has happened. Oftentimes there can be a sense of denial. This didn't happen. I just saw them this morning. Everything was fine. His health is good. I remember on a particular Sabbath morning, we were staying a couple hours away. Our dog was barking. We put him in the crate. He kept barking. He just was not familiar with where we were. And so we decided to put him in the crate in the middle of the night. This was my decision. And put him in the trunk of the car where if he barks, he's at least outside. He's in the trunk. It was a nice, cool evening. He'll be just fine. And so that's what I did. Everybody got their rest. I got up, worked on my sermon, got in the car, drove the distance I needed to preach the sermon. Towards the end of my sermon, I keep getting these buzzes. Bzz, 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 bzz. Where's the dog? Where's Cooper? Dawns on me where Cooper is. He's in the trunk of the car. It's a sunny day. Warm, sunny day. And I run out there. And there's my beloved dog, my pet that I loved, just down. And I try to wake him up. We could call that denial, couldn't we? He's stiff. Rigor mortis has started to set in. What's my response? I run back into the church where they're having potluck. I need a bowl. And I fill the bowl with water, and I take it back out to the car. If I can just get my dog to drink, he'll be fine. It's denial. Grief helps us to acknowledge the reality that something's happened. Those of you that have been through a loss, you know that short-term memory is just gone. You can't remember what you did today. You can't remember what you did yesterday. Even big decisions, places that you've gone, things that you've done. You look back at pictures, I don't even remember doing that. I was just kind of in this haze, a sense of lostness. And friends, there's no shortcut around grief. You can't ignore it. You can't outwork it. You can't medicate it. And the longer you put it off, the longer it will take, and the more difficult it will be. And so the best thing you can do is to grieve early and to grieve intensely. Because that oftentimes brings about the best result. Because if we stuff it, thinking this hurts too badly, if I can just shorten the pain, get rid of the pain, lessen the symptoms, it will come back. And oftentimes with greater severity. Number 2, grief encourages self-reflection. Yes, it's hard. There's no shortcut. And oftentimes you have to look inward. Ask the hard questions. And oftentimes in grief, you feel like you're crazy. Have you ever felt that way? In fact, it's one of the most commonly asked questions of counselors going through heavy grief. They ask their counselor, am I crazy? I'm feeling this. I'm doing this. This is how I'm functioning. I just feel like I've lost my mind. Am I crazy? Friends, you're not crazy. You're grieving. It's normal. It's part of it. Number 3, it provides an emotional release. Again, you can't stuff it. You have to process it. And the only way through grief is to go through it. Number 4, grieving often brings people together. As they talk, as they share, as they connect. Have you ever seen, I've seen as a pastor many times, an estranged family, and then there's a big loss, and all of a sudden the estrangement just disintegrates as the family comes together. That's a beautiful thing. Number 5, it validates the person's role in your life, and maybe the life of the church or the community. They had a significant impact. We have to recognize that. It's the thing we have to do. A few more here. Number 6, suppressing grief can have negative impacts on physical health. Oftentimes people that try and outwork the grief, it comes back in other ways. High blood pressure, inability to sleep, major weight changes. I mean, the list is almost inexhaustible. Your body keeps a score. And so you have to recognize that, and you have to grieve. Number 7, processing your grief helps to build resilience so you can cope with future challenges. You grow in your Christian experience. You grow in your faith in God. It gets stronger as you learn to trust Him more fully and more completely in the midst of and through your grief. And it helps you to prioritize what is really of value in this life. And number 8, grieving helps bring closure. We found all these things to be true in our own experience because if you're not careful, you can just become numb. And being in shock, if you will, has a role. It's as if there's too much. I can't process all of this at this moment, and so I'm in shock. But we can't stay there forever. Because if I'm numb to the pain, then I'm also going to be numb to joy. If I'm numb to hurt, I'm going to be numb to happiness. I'm just going to be numb. All of life is going to be transitory. I don't care, doesn't matter. And I'll fall deeper into depression. But if I will face the pain, and that's not easy to do. How do you face the pain? Counselors have told us you plan times to grieve. Well, who likes to grieve? So we've done this with our family on various occasions. On anniversary to the loss of our son James, maybe it was the second anniversary, I think. We watch the whole memorial service again and the memories and pictures and videos, and we talk of him often. We look at pictures often, but we went through all of that again. And our oldest daughter, Lauren, she said, why are we doing this? Why do we have this before we, why are we, guess on this afternoon, this is what we're going to do. I don't want to do that. We told her the reasons why we felt it was important, so she came along with us. And sure enough, we cried, she cried, we all cried. Was it hard? Yes. Was it easy? No. But then I have to tell you the other piece of this. It lasted for I don't know how many hours, and at the other end, there was as if a weight had lifted. There was a happiness that we hadn't had for some time. There was a joy in their faces. There was laughter. There was giggling. I don't fully even know how to explain it, other than as we process our grief and feel the hard things, we're also able to feel the joyful things all the more. And so, yes, we can choose to be numb and to live numb. But I don't want to live there. And maybe somebody's saying, I haven't done those things. I haven't handled it properly. I haven't gone through whatever the thing that you're feeling. Well, then it's not too late. Take the opportunity. Grieve as you need to grieve, so you can feel joy and happiness again. When Katie told Kevin she wanted a separation, she brought up her pain and her disappointment. And she also brought up the abortions. Not just one, two. They'd had sex before they were married. She got pregnant on 2 separate occasions. But they took care of it. So they separated, husband and wife, and after about 2 weeks of separation, Kevin was praying and heard God say to him, you and Katie need to have a funeral. You need to ask her to forgive you. And so Kevin was convicted, and that's exactly what he did. And so he called up Katie. He says, are you willing? We've talked about this before. We've never done it. But I'd like to take us to this waterfall that has special meaning for us, to bring our Bibles, to have a funeral for these 2 children. Maybe one was a boy, maybe one was a girl. We don't know. She agreed. They got in the car. They drove the distance, parked the car at the trailhead. It was not a pretty day. It was overcast. The wind was howling. Branches were falling. The lightning was crashing. The rain was coming down. What do? Let's go. They got out of the car. Kevin took his backpack. They hiked the distance to the waterfall. As they're processing all of these things, they're thinking about the painful journey they've had together. They're thinking about their moral compromises. They're thinking about the abortions, the guilt, the shame. How they had blamed each other. Their fear of rejection. And as they get near the falls, they can see the falls. They went up off the trail to this little level spot. And it's there that Kevin opened up his backpack and took out his Bible and took out a tarp. And it might sound silly to you, but it had great importance to them. They took out 2 baby dolls that he brought. One little boy, one little girl. They named the baby dolls. And they held these dolls in their arms, and with tears they asked for forgiveness. And then Kevin asked for forgiveness for not protecting Katie. And he confessed for his selfishness. And so then they dug through that icy ground, and they buried these 2 dolls wrapped in this tarp, and they covered them up. And they held each other there in the rain and cried and prayed and ask for God's forgiveness. And then a remarkable thing happened. Suddenly the wind stopped. The rain stopped. And just out of nowhere, the sun peeked through the clouds. And it shined down on this couple holding each other. And they describe it as if God was putting his arms around us, saying, "You are forgiven." And they both sensed they were standing on holy ground. And so in the sunlight, they walked down to the falls, and there was one more thing they had to do. And so Kevin pulled a hatchet out of his backpack. Whether you like this part of the story or not, this is how it played out. And they prayed, "I've been a slave to anger and bitterness toward you. I have harbored resentment and isolated myself from you," he said to his wife. "By the grace of God, I transfer all that anger and bitterness to this hatchet." And he threw it into the base of the falls. Friends, that processing of their loss, their grief, addressing the hurt and the heartache, freed them from the pain of the past. And they went from there and built their lives together. Yes, unresolved grief multiplies problems. But grief can become a catalyst for personal growth and healing and even a spiritual breakthrough. Third thing to put on this list: respond with integrity when your enemy falls. Openly acknowledge the hurt, but then move forward with resolve and with hope. We're still in 2 Samuel now, chapter 2, verse 1. It says, "It happened after that." How much time has passed, we're not sure. But it happened after this that David inquired of the Lord, saying, "Shall I go up to any of the cities of Judah?" And the Lord said, "Go up." Essentially, it's time. And David said, "Where shall I go up?" And he said, "To Hebron." Verse 2, so David went. And then verse 4, then the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. And so just like that, David's fugitive years had come to a close. And through this very personal and national tragedy, David asks and inquires of the Lord, and he says, "It's time, go." I suggest it was a moment that tested the integrity of his private world, calling for his real feelings towards the failure of someone who had hurt him deeply. And it's this moment that tests his courage. But he openly acknowledges his hurt. He embraces the loss. He savors the memories. And then he moves on with resolve and with hope. And friends, that's what God longs for you and for me. In the losses and challenges of life, He doesn't ask us to run, to hide, to ignore, to work more hours. He wants us to grieve. Last verse, I don't have it on the screen. It's in Isaiah chapter 53. Beginning verse 2, it says, "He has no form of comeliness, and when we see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. He is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief." There's the word again. "And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But what's the reality of the situation? He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him. And by his stripes, what is it? We're healed. Jesus knew grief. He was acquainted. And he says, I'm going to die for your grief. And by my grace, by my stripes, through my blood, you too can be healed. We're going to sing our closing hymn. It's number 532. So Larissa, if you could come back up and lead us. And let's stand as we sing it. It's Day by Day, hymn number 532.